Hi, thanks for coming to this session and welcome to this video in the Central and North London branch library of videos. Again, we've got Stav, who's leading our session today, and this time Stav Picius is with Dennis Murphy. So Stav, over to you.
Thank you so much, Darling, for having us. So today we have a special session, and today we're going to talk with you about understanding the cyber threat environment. And with me, I have Dennis Murphy, and Dennis will soon introduce himself. Dennis has quite an experience with the Five Eyes intelligence community. So for those of you who do not know Dennis, Dennis, if you can just introduce yourself in a couple of words.
Sure. Good afternoon. So my name is Dennis Murphy, and by the accent, I'm Canadian, currently living in the UK, and currently aligned with Gately Legal as their primary threat consultant, kind of across the threat spectrum. But prior to that, I spent more than 27 years within the Five Eyes intelligence community, retiring at the end of 2018. As a senior executive with extensive background in the intelligence collection side of things, and obviously coming from the cryptologic intelligence community, the basis for everything that we do is cyber. So I'm certainly well versed with respect to advanced cyber threats across the spectrum.
Okay, so you're highly qualified to introduce this matter to us. And thank you, Dennis, for the introduction. So, and by the way, for those of our viewers that are not familiar with the Five Eyes community, can you please let us know what is this organization, what it includes?
Sure. So it's the alliance of the 5 English-speaking countries. So it's the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So they make up the Five Eyes, and it's predominantly the cryptologic services. So the SIGINT agencies, if you will.
Okay, wonderful. So without further ado, let's talk a bit about the current spectrum of threats. Like, what are we facing? And when we talk about cyber threats, what are really the things, the matters that we need to think about? Who are the actors? Who are the company that really should consider these threats for themselves?
Sure. I think it's the most important thing to note before you start speaking specifically about the actors themselves is kind of cyber threat is something that is enduring, and it's evolving on a daily basis, certainly unlike anything I've ever seen in my career with respect to just watching technological advancements and just the creativity on the part of the hostile actors themselves. But, you know, from a consumer perspective, or if you're, whether it's a government organization or a private sector entity, you need to understand this is something that will be with you for your lifetime, personally and professionally. And I think that's very important. With respect to kind of the range of the actors themselves, you know, I mean, I guess if you would kind of, you know, the highest end of the spectrum would be where I come from, i.e., you know, the more advanced nation states, large, you know, national intelligence programs and capabilities. But, you know, that transcends it, you know, down into, you know, incredibly skilled cybercrime groups, you know, nationally associated hacking groups, and then ultimately right down to potentially on occasion very skilled individuals or lone wolves. But I think what's very important is, you know, it's not necessarily the size that matters in certain cases. More often than not, you'll see some of the smaller entities, including individuals with incredible technical capability, that, you know, in certain cases, through my experience, can almost rival those of what intelligence services offer. And as you know, it's in the public knowledge. For instance, things like NSA tools had been stolen and had been put out there for sale. So you do have private citizens who can access national level capability.
I see. And you know, sometimes when we speak about cyber threats with companies, so for some companies, it's not really clear whether they can be a target or not. For example, if I own a company we have like 20 employees, and we may operate in an industry which is not so appealing for attackers. So do we also need to think about cyber threats? Do we really need to think about all these words like cyber landscape and cyber actors and adversaries? Like, is it relevant for me? And again, what is the real threshold for that?
Absolutely. It's relevant to everybody. I mean, I can understand why, for instance, you know, a smaller or more innocuous organization might think that they might not be of interest. Well, as you know, you and I had discussed previously, more often than not, sometimes those are the targets that the hostile actors will go after, if you will, kind of almost a supply chain attack to go after a larger vendor or a larger target of opportunity. So, in my view, I find organizations are either very ostrich-like in their mentality, i.e. they kind of, bury their head in the sand and just hope that it never happens to them. Or they don't necessarily really understand the threat. And, through my experiences in working with boards and CEOs, and that is a very common problem that, there's still a bit of a reset that needs to happen between, for instance, the CISO of a large organization and the top team, and explaining to that board, why it matters. And if they get it and they understand it's a business risk that it's enduring and they have to invest in, then they're going to. But I think, everybody needs to have expectations, whether it's personally, professionally, organizationally, you're vulnerable.
And you mentioned adversaries from several areas. You mentioned from nation state to individuals. So what is the degree of the defense that the nation state will provide to its businesses? So for example, if I'm a UK business, so where does my own security perimeter ends, and where does the UK, like the GCHQ or other UK nation state organization really protect my business? You can, again, I guess it's similar for every other country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad question, but I would certainly, if you wanted to look at kind of the UK construct, I would say that the UK government is very forward-leaning in that kind of government. Well, so, the National Cybersecurity Centre engagement with the private sector, clearly resources are what they are, so they can't, spend the same amount of time that they would, for instance, with a large infrastructure company than they would with a small textile manufacturer. But what they are doing is making sure that all that relevant information as it relates to cyber threats and what one needs to do to protect themselves is out there for them. So I think most nation states are kind of adopting that. I know we're doing the same thing in Canada. The US, I think, is attempting the same thing, but they're just so large with so many organizations, it's a little more difficult to organize. But it's critically important that government takes that lead in educating and when they, and working directly with these private sector vendors when they can.
So you're saying that governmental responsibility or activities are mainly in the areas of education, or there are more technical or practical help that companies should expect from the government, to get from the government?
So I would say the education includes the technical support and advice and guidance. It's just that, these large government organizations don't have the time, for instance, to work with a very small entity on, protecting their infrastructure, right? They're working with large energy companies and critical infrastructure organizations. And so, I mean, I do believe that they're doing the best that they can. But more often than not, it's incumbent upon the vendors themselves to go out and search that information. To be fair, the government are doing a great job in advertising these services. And, I do believe that there's a massive benefit when those smaller organizations adopt it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So let's talk a bit about cyber threat actors and maybe the motivations behind their attacks, like what really make them hack the companies. So yes, Dennis.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, from a nation state perspective, I think, the motivation is geopolitical is a very broad-based term, but I think, in many ways, I mean, cyber capabilities, they very much are considered a strategic tool, right? I mean, they're no different now to what an advanced military would have considered, a nuclear arsenal to be, right? I mean, they have that strategic power. So, they are going to use them to disrupt their adversaries, whether that's actually affecting and bringing down critical infrastructure or, the stock markets are incredibly important things to countries. The cyber criminals, I would say, are predominantly in it for profiteering. I mean, there are criminal-based organizations who have direct alignments with government. I mean, Russia is a great example where we know that there's direct connections between the Russian state and many of these groups. So, more often than not, for the Russian state, it's a tremendous opportunity to hide themselves or obfuscate themselves and let these threat actors do what they need them to do. But I think for the criminals, it's mostly about making money. The hacktivists, again, right, it's their true beliefs, right? For instance, I mean, the cyber attacks against oil and gas companies, right, trying to kind of make their point with respect to, how they feel that the environment is being affected. Terror groups, I mean, yes, ideological, but, the lion's share of my background is counterterrorism, and I have a lot of experience in observing and stopping counterterrorism related cyber activity. And I mean, they definitely were trying to work towards building capabilities that would actually cause a physical effect, whether they would use cyber means to enable a physical attack, whether they would use cyber means in a perfect world for them to bring down a power grid. They aspired to do these things, and these are things that we need to be very worried about. The thrill seeker set, I mean, these are these young kids who have capability and, they're not too smart yet, i.e. emotionally and potentially intellectually, and they do those things essentially to see if they can get away with it without really understanding the gravity or the degree of threat and havoc that they can cause. Insider threats, again, very deep in my experience in the counterintelligence world. People who feel that, that they've been treated poorly within their organization and they want to take out that, grief upon the organization, and they will do it very often through cyber means, whether it's themselves or whether it's, them providing a potential threat actor with an opportunity.
So if I'm an executive in a company, so I totally understand and see my like why I need to protect myself from insider threats, from script kiddies or thrill seekers, and from other attack vectors. But do you think companies should or can protect themselves from nation states attacks?
I think if a company really follows, I mean, a very, very robust cybersecurity program, top to bottom, and, I think we'll get to that later in terms of some of what we consider to be the key component parts, they are going to exponentially protect themselves. Government cannot guarantee that it can protect itself from a nation state attack, and we've seen that more often than not. So there's no silver bullet as it relates to cyber, and there's no cyber practitioner that would ever say that somebody at some point in time during their lifetime, organizationally or personally, will not be affected or breached. It's just not possible. Do I think that the nation states are going to care about the majority of private sector companies that aren't associated with things that they know can directly impact or cause harm? Probably not, but anybody's vulnerable. That's the short answer.
And obviously you need to be as secure as your industry expects you, as your regulator expects you, as a client expects you to be. So as long as you align with that, you're doing the best you can. Obviously you're in a better position. And
completely agree.
The government obviously does whatever it's possible in order to help you with that. So let's talk a bit about some statistics about several sectors and industries, and what are we seeing in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the financial sector, so a couple of things. The financial sector, I would certainly say, is the sector that puts the most money against this in terms of kind of trying to protect themselves, but they're also a very, very high,
money inside,
but they're a very high profile attack surface, right? I mean, there's a lot of mileage to be had in successfully penetrating a bank. So, you just look at the recent examples over the last few years, like Equifax, and I mean, you're talking massive amounts of money that can be lost. You're talking, hundreds of millions of, customers and personal identifying information. And, that's very worrying. That trend will not go down without any question. The technology piece, I think you're also seeing a lot of interesting things across varying technology spaces in terms of interest, on whether it's on the part of nation states to learn more and, essentially kind of penetrate and steal that kind of intellectual property. Again, that will grow. Business professional services, and again, I mean, you always have to remember that there's an alignment, right? There's a chain. So if you successfully penetrate somewhere along that chain, you can probably stand a much greater chance into getting into a broader kind of, sectoral opportunity. Manufacturing, I don't think is quite to what I thought it would be in terms of kind of scope and scale of attack, although I would say that it's probably more bespoke things that people are after. And again, that probably lends itself more to nation state actors. The government related attacks, they are, for me, it's more of a question about what we don't know. I think that, these networks are incredibly well protected. we do have very advanced mechanisms and systems to kind of hopefully provide that detection of potential compromise or compromise. But, I think a lot of it comes down to how transparent governments are with respect to actually releasing that information about whether they were penetrated or not. And more importantly, whether they even know. I mean, some of these very advanced actors, as you know, Stav, a lot of them are very patient. So they will gain access and they will sit and they will wait and they won't do anything until such a time that they've created the opportunity for themselves within the network to get what they're after.
Also, I mentioned the fact that there are some criminal syndicates that maybe are fostered by the government, and maybe the government supports them. So it will not be a classical, nation-state attack when you have these battalions of hackers that are sitting, in rows and hacking another government or another agency, but rather if a government neglects or even doesn't stop a malicious group that act within the country because it really aligned with this country's agenda. So it's also something that it's in a way nation-state attack, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree, and it's a tsunami in terms of just how big these attacks can be. I mean, if you look at the Chinese capabilities, I mean, their government organizations are massive, and then you augment that with tens and tens and tens of thousands of very skilled, cyber attackers. It's a monumental problem.
And we'll talk about specific attacks. Would like to share some examples of some attack scenarios, and maybe Dennis, you can share some examples from your experience, some of the sophisticated attacks that you faced. And
right. Well, obviously, I can't say a great deal with respect to what I've come across or what I know in my former life. There's lines I'm not allowed to cross. But if I was going to generically talk about some of the kind of the more advanced things that people should be worried about, and you and I have had these conversations, and I tend to often go back to supply chain in terms of that's the vulnerability. Certainly, than in my former life, that's where I was looking. I had my target in mind, but more often than not, going directly after them would not be a successful venture. I would go after those who I knew were associated with them. So I think supply chain attacks are very important. Many of those are not necessarily just cyber-based, i.e., one thing that I would mention is that what we've seen in the community now is this incredible convergence of threat. So what used to be very separate disciplines, i.e., cyber threat, physical threat, now they're combined. Now they mutually enable each other. So for instance, you would conduct a supply chain attack by using a human source, for instance, to get something somewhere into a system to allow us to do what we needed to do. I mean, this is very advanced nation state related things. But if you kind of look at, more broadly, again, in levels of sophistication, you look at things like, the WannaCry attacks, NotPetya, and just like how devastating they were. And the really frightening thing is the actors who unleashed those capabilities didn't probably anticipate how global they would become or how quickly they would spread. What happened with the NHS, with WannaCry, and the impacts were significant. So, the thing I worry about is just this level of social engineering that is just, it's improving to a point that it's very hard to, I have to pay a very reluctant professional courtesy or respect to these individuals in terms of their creativity and what they're capable of doing. But, you look now, COVID, again, you and I have talked about that. COVID is certainly probably the most recent and enduring and massive example of how, cyber attackers are taking advantage of human frailty, fear, and, augmenting that in very multi-layered attacks, starting with disinformation to get people very upset and concerned, followed up with a beautifully socially engineered email with the kinds of information that I, as someone who's worried, is going to click on, and then delivering a malicious payload. So I think, it's something that is just going to continue to evolve. And Lord knows where it's going to go. Right now, you look at, the Internet of Things and those capabilities that are now exploitable. We know that. We're concerned about that. Just, name me a technology that doesn't have a potential vulnerability in it. It's tough. It is very hard.
Yes, it just carries the impact of sophisticated social engineering attacks, of the non-tech hacking when attacks can be delivered by means that people are not expecting them to be, and that attackers sometimes they can even, there is this concept of A/B testing, so they can create several attacks, several scenarios, and just test them, and just apply even apply some statistical engine and apply some methods in order to get the most sophisticated stuff, in most sophisticated attack, the one that will penetrate the network in the best probability possible, and then just deliver it with the right mechanism, with the right context, in the right time, and to be very hard to stop it. And sometimes I noticed that sometimes even security professionals or even people who are really techy and really feel confident with their capabilities not to press on these links and not to fall for phishing attacks and not to fall for these social engineering attacks, they sometimes are the people that fall the most because of this their confidence, because of their thinking of it will never happen to us.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think, you look at, for instance, like AI and machine learning, right? I mean, I consider that to be a monumental opportunity to move forward, in so many different ways. I mean, medicine, just moving economies forward and just speed. But it's also a curse because, these threat actors are going to take advantage of the same capability. Like, you imagine a highly, highly automated AI created cyber threat, right? So it just sits there, it monitors the network, it's got everything into it. As soon as it sees an opportunity, it goes, and that can be global, right? So these guys can create these capabilities, turn it on, and just, it goes. That scares me. I mean, those things really do frighten me. So obviously you're going to have to be able to build a comparable AI, ML, cyber defense capability to mitigate that. And that's a tall order, I think.
You even can see these examples even with the current technologies. The same as companies run their vulnerability scanners in order to detect vulnerabilities and flaws in their networks. So the same scanners are used by attackers to discover the same vulnerabilities when we're launching an attack. So
exactly,
it will just get worse, and we will just see more of these implementations. So yeah, I'm curious to see what the future will bring. So we discussed about the threats and about how attacks look like and the threat actors. And now let's be more practical. Let's talk about how you can manage that, how you can manage your threats, what companies should be thinking of, when managing their cyber threats.
Sure. Again, through the many conversations that you and I have had, most people kind of understand there's that kind of overall triumvirate for cybersecurity, that kind of people, processes, technology. I would consider my expertise and background to be in the people processes space. So I'm a true believer in that if you don't kind of implement those things, you can have the most technologically advanced infrastructure and you're still going to fail. So for me, it always starts with leadership. And it goes to what I said a few minutes ago, that the leadership need to understand the importance and the impact that cybersecurity brings, or cyber threat brings, to their organization. And it can clearly be kind of equated to them as a business risk, which they understand, and what's the outcome, the impact, what is it going to cost me? But it has to start with leadership, the leadership. And I find now, with respect to kind of cybersecurity, leadership has to change. I mean, I think they have to be far more agile in the way they react. I think they have to be far more empowering. I think it can't just be a hierarchical structure. They have to actually empower other teams to whether it's respond, or, they have to be much better with respect to their business continuity planning, their emergency response planning. And these are all things which are hugely important and sometimes aren't prioritized as much. And then the next evolution of that is really, you create that kind of culture within your organization so everybody understands the importance of cybersecurity, but more importantly, they're empowered to be kind of part of the solution, right? So you give people responsibilities, you make sure that you're continually educating them. And that engenders a much stronger culture, and people who take cybersecurity more seriously, they take greater responsibility in terms of how they operate. These are good things, right? And then when you complement that with the accountability structures, the policy, the governance, the regulation, right? Things like, access management, all these types of rules and regulations. If those are coherent and those are abided by, then I kind of think you're kind of already 75% of the way. And then clearly, the final evolution is kind of the technologies that you need. And clearly, based on the size of the organization that you are, you're going to have to kind of create what's affordable, really, what is going to give you your best opportunity for protecting yourselves. And as I said many minutes ago, you're always going to have to invest. So, the cyber defense tools I buy today, I'm probably going to be replacing in 6 months. That's just the way it is. And I think if you kind of look at those 4 pillars and you adopt them seriously, I think you're positioning yourself to be a very resilient and strong cybersecurity organization, right? And then we go back to what we said earlier when we were talking about the government and being involved. For instance, as you know, like the National Cybersecurity Center, right? They will certify companies, right? You can get that gold level standard from the National Cybersecurity Center saying, the cyber essentials. This company is very serious about how they behave and how they protect themselves. So I think there's so many good things that are coming. I just think it's education, and awareness.
And what's also interesting to see are the intersections between these sections, because obviously your technology incorporates with your processes, and the processes are managed by the people. So also there are a lot of touch points between the different pillars. And when you launch your security program, you need to obviously educate your staff, and you need to have your security champions, and you have this layered approach of defense in depth. And there is this diagram that you prepared, and I would be really glad if you can maybe explain it to us as well.
Well, I mean, I think, really, you look at kind of, the 3 headlines of each of the bubbles, right? So kind of cyber threat management, information security, risk management, all encompass the previous things that we just talked about. I just think it becomes more granular, right? So in the threat management piece, in addition to, I'm a strong believer in having kind of an over the horizon look, i.e., I'm a big believer organizations should be investing in threat intelligence, to better prepare themselves for the threat that is coming. And then you get into kind of the analytics space and all the various probably more tactical things that one can do to better protect themselves or kind of really provide a very deep assessment. The policy and compliance space, in the information security, again, right, it has to be divided up into, appropriate and probably prioritized things. But I think the policy and, the compliance space to me is probably the most important, especially now that everybody is being heavily regulated. So obviously you've got things like GDPR and other things where organizations are paying very, very dear and serious prices when it becomes clear to a regulator that they haven't implemented those types of things that they need to do. And again, they're following like these very robust and what I consider to be incredible structures like NIST, ISO 27001, these really great things that organizations can use, to really implement, engage, and really kind of mark against how they're doing. Risk management is something, again, where I think you have to have that capacity where you can stand back and really assess your organization and how they're doing. You have to report it. You have to be able to measure risk, but it's incredibly informative because when you do it correctly, it's going to allow you to kind of identify those gaps and weaknesses and what you need to do to fill them. And, as you noted, I think, there is a connection between all 3 and that they really do kind of transcend each other. I don't know what else I can really say in that space.
So what we can really say is maybe how to integrate all of this into a single process. How do you create this process? How do you initiate it from the beginning till the ongoing process that really self-contained and really takes care for your risks?
Yeah, I mean, and I think these kind of 4 arrows are simple, but they're effective. Clearly, like organization, when you're starting down this road or you're at the beginning of your journey, right? You need to do that scoping process. You need to understand across kind of the 3 bubbles that we just discussed a couple minutes ago in terms of requirements, what's needed, right? And then obviously there's all the subsequent gathering of information. There's assessment of this information. Then there's further kind of things that you need to create from a structural perspective. You follow on, analytically, you identify based upon the risks that you've discovered, what you need, costing, and all these various things. And then ultimately you have to implement it. And what I do find is many of these private sector diagrams or circles or structural things are incredibly similar to what we did in the intelligence community, right? A lot of this is not dissimilar to the intelligence cycle, which I find really good because I know how powerful that is in terms of how organizations can benefit from thinking in that way. So I do think that it's critical to have a process. I've come across many organizations that don't, and it's kind of very haphazard in how they take their approaches. So I think if you have a guiding light, that's going to help you kind of be far more structured and far more resilient.
Mm-hmm. Great. So companies will have their budgets, will have their processes, have the trained people, and supported technologies, which will hopefully be reviewed every half a year because technology changes very fast. So Dennis, thank you so much for that. And to finalize this session and really to leave our audience with takeaways, like really things to think about after the session, something to take on, how would you summarize it?
Right. So I think it's, really just kind of reaffirming what you and I have just discussed over the last several minutes. And I think for me, the most important thing is the recognition people need to have that this problem is with us forever, right? This is not something that we can all look back on 15 years from now and go, wow, remember that cyber threat thing? No, I mean, in 15 years, it's going to be exponentially more difficult. So I think it's critical for organizations, they have to get it, right? They have to understand this is a serious threat to their viability, and it's only going to grow in threat and scope and scale and complexity, and they have to be able to meet that. And that's the natural follow-on, that organizations need to prioritize cybersecurity. Now, as I said earlier, the simplest way to do that is not to box it strictly into a cyber problem, right? But make it more of a business risk, because cyber transcends the organization, right? Cyber attack or cyber threat can affect every part of an organization, whether that's the infrastructure itself or whether it can affect comms, HR. Like it can bring organizations to their knees across very, very many kind of openings within the organization. So that's very important. And then finally, again, right, kind of where I'm a real evangelist about the kind of the people part of it. If you get the culture right and you get the behaviors in place and people really believe and feel empowered that they're contributing, and you've got a leadership structure that's really pushing it. And, I think your point that you made several minutes ago about, kind of whether it's someone who considers themselves to be more experienced or a leader and I know what I'm doing. I mean, my experience, the C-suite are always the problem and the threat. And by some workshops I've run, that was their own admission that they're clicking on these links. So, they have to lead by example. So if you've got a strong leadership team that leads by example, makes mistakes and admits it, they're not punitive in the way that, obviously organizations have to set structures and rules and limits, and, you can only tolerate so many mistakes. But I think it's if you can create that team, simplistically create that team, you're going to be a much more powerful and robust organization.
Okay. So Dennis, thank you for that. Thank you for your words. Thank you for the explanations. And I would like to thank also BCS for having us here. And back to you, Dalim.
Wow, thank you very much for a great session. Indeed, a lot of useful discussions and some very wise words as well. Do you think it's all going to happen? Do you think we're going to watch things like this and then magically the next time we talk, there's nothing to talk about? Well, you made the messages there. And it's something that we all need to take away, isn't it? And act on.
Absolutely. This is something that we all need to be considering for a very, very long time or forever. So thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was much fun.
It's been a pleasure all around. Thank you. And look out for more great videos from the Library of Videos. Thank you and goodbye for now.